Would you like some tips on how to draw black or white fur using pastels? Well, stay tuned and I'll show you exactly how I created this husky. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. So today I'm using Clairefontaine pastel mat as usual, and I like this paper because it has a little bit of grit to it, almost like a sanded paper. In comparison to a lot of other papers out there on the market, the other papers seem to be a little bit smooth and you can't really add as many layers as you can with this paper. And I've also heard good things about other type of sanded papers as well, but this is my go-to paper. I haven't really tried many others because I enjoy working on this one so much and it does what I need it to do. When I work with animals that are black or white, I usually use a toned paper because it's actually much easier because you can actually put white or really light colors down as well as really dark colors down, and you can see both of them. So you can start with the highlights or the shadows and work in between that. Whereas if you started with a white piece of paper, it can be very hard to try and judge your values, and you kind of have to work in reverse and then fill in the shadows before you get to the highlights. And the highlights are such a light color that it looks almost the same as the background, so it can be really hard to work like that. So I've taped my work down with some acid-free masking tape and transferred my image using transfer paper. Usually I start with pan pastels as a base layer, but sometimes I like to mix it up and use something different. So today I started with conte sticks for the base layer, and I actually started my pastel journey with just conte sticks and Stabilo Carbothello pencils. And I created some artwork that rivals what I'm creating today with a larger amount of supplies, so it shows you that you really don't need much to get started with. I like the conte sticks because they're a harder pastel, which means that even when you blend them out, the strokes tend to show through and it can create a really nice effect for the fur. And for this reason, I'm using pan pastels for the background because I really wanted that to be a nice smooth effect and have no strokes showing through. It can be a bit harder to get a smoother look with the conte sticks than it would be if you used pan pastels or soft pastel sticks though. So I've started with the darker bits of fur first, and I don't always do it this way. Sometimes I start with the eyes, but I chose to start with the dark fur because it helps me not lose my place. It gives me a good idea of my values and how dark I need to go in other areas because I already have that darkest part down to compare it to. So there are some dark areas around the eyes and the nose and the mouth, but these areas are a bit too small to be able to control the conte sticks in that area. So I've just gone straight in with the pastel pencils, so it's a little bit easier to control the strokes that I'm putting in and not lose any of my lines. White and black fur can be a real challenge for some people, and I've actually got a tutorial showing you exactly how you can draw a white dog on white paper, and that goes through all of the steps that I do before I even start my project in terms of editing my photos so that I can see all the hidden colors in there and doing little swatches on the side of my paper. So if you are struggling with white or black animals, I'd highly recommend watching that tutorial. It is colored pencil, but all of the techniques can be applied to pastel as well. So I totally recommend checking that out, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. But basically, all fur, including white and black fur, actually reflects the colors around it, and it's even more so for black and white fur. So for example, if the dog is outside, it will most likely have blue reflected somewhere in the coat because the sky is blue. I recently drew a Labrador or a Golden Retriever, I don't know, one of those, and it was sitting on kind of a purple coloured pavement, which was reflected in the fur, so I put a lot of purple into that fur. Sometimes these colours can be very subtle and hard to see in your reference photo, so I take my reference photo and import it into a photo editing app or a program. And I usually use Microsoft PowerPoint for this, but I hype up the saturation so much that it looks like it has really bright colours, and then you can use those colours in those areas as subtle hints in your own artwork. You can actually see in my drawing in the first few layers, I've got quite a bit of blues and purples in there. It doesn't really look natural at all at the moment, but those are those subtle colours that are going to show through at the end after you've put in more details on top of that. For my first layer, it usually looks really messy and very bright and colourful and almost out of place, like an expressionistic or slightly abstract piece. But after I've blended out this layer and I've started adding more neutral colours in the following layers, it really starts to come together and the subtle colours underneath will show through subtly rather than being so in your face at the moment. Throughout the layering process, I'm making sure that I pay attention to the direction of the fur in my reference photo. Especially because I'm using conte sticks for the first few layers, I can't completely blend out the strokes, which means that the strokes that I put down will be visible in the end result, so I have to make sure that they're going in the right direction. It's also really important to make sure that your fur is the right length. For example, on the chest and the body and the edges of the face, the fur is really quite long, so you want to have longer pencil strokes to reflect how long the fur actually is. Because if you stop and start your pencil strokes, it can look like the fur has stopped and started, so it looks shorter than it's supposed to be. And for example, around the edges of the ears and just above the nose, you don't want to put long pencil strokes there because it will make it look like it has really long hair in those areas, which isn't correct. So pay attention to the length of your pencil strokes as well as the direction. If you're working with soft pastels or pan pastels, you can blend out the strokes a little bit more easily. You should still follow the direction of the fur just in case. My reference photo has quite a dark shadow on the right hand side of her face, but I've chosen to make it a little bit more subtle so it's not as distracting. And I've chosen to increase the saturation of my colours in that shadow area to create the effect of a shadow rather than actually making it a really dark value. I chose the background colour based on a colour that was in the original reference photo. And that is a really good tip. If you don't know what colour background you want to do, choose a colour that already exists in your reference because the fur of the animal will probably reflect some of these colours anyway, so it is going to blend in and not stand out too much. Even if it's just a colour that's on the fence in the background or something that's in the pavement or on a building next to it or something like that, just make sure that you pick one of those colours and it will usually always work out just fine. And you can always choose a complementary or opposite colour if you like, but I find that a more subtle colour choice that already appears in the reference image will always look nice. So I chose to use a colour that I could see in the fence behind her in this photo, and it also appears inside the ears and the shadow areas of the white fur and a little bit under her eyes. I always try and add a bit more of the background colour into the subject itself anyway to help it look like it belongs in this background and doesn't look like it was cut out and pasted there. So I purposely added more of this red-brown colour that was on the fence into the shadow areas of the white fur. And I've also made the background slightly lighter behind the darker shadow side of the dog, and then slightly darker behind the lighter side of the dog. It just looks a bit nicer this way and it creates a nice lighting effect. I'm using pastel pencils in the last few layers to get some of the fur detail. I try not to sharpen my pencils too much because they tend to crumble in the sharpener and I waste so much of my pencil this way. So for most of my drawing, I'll keep it kind of blunt, or I'll sharpen away the wooden casing of the pencil with a craft knife or a Stanley knife, because I don't put really minute details in my pastel works on purpose. From a normal viewing distance, a metre or two away, you can't actually see the tiny little strokes. It's only when you're standing really close to it. And I love seeing the brush strokes or the pencil strokes on artwork that looks realistic from a distance. So I usually don't try and put every single little strand of fur in there and just give that general gist of fur texture. If you do try and put every little strand of fur in, sometimes it can look wiry, especially if you're working on a piece that's this size. If you sharpen your pencil to a fine point and you put in every single little hair, the actual pencil point is going to be thicker than the hair in real life. And so when you look at it, it looks like the animal has really thick chunks of hair, and in reality, it doesn't actually look like that in real life. So I try and just give the general gist of the fur texture and blend it out a little bit so it looks a little bit more soft. In some parts, I do actually need to sharpen my pencil to get into the smaller areas, like around the eyes. So I use a manual crank handle sharpener, or I'll continue to sharpen the pastel with a knife until it's as pointy as I need it to be. You can also use sandpaper to sand down the tip of your point if you like, just to make it even sharper. Just remember that pastel pencils are very crumbly in comparison to coloured pencils or graphite, so even if you do get a super fine point, it will most likely crumble or snap when it hits the paper. I have a video showing you how to sharpen pastel pencils, which I'll link below if you're having trouble with that. In between each layer, I try to blend out the pastel softly so that it doesn't look as grainy, but you can still see some of the pencil strokes. You probably shouldn't use your finger like I do. You can wrap a tissue around your finger to stop the oils from your fingers getting onto your artwork. I just have a bad habit of doing it and I really need to stop. But there are also different ways of blending out your pastel as well, like blending tools, or you can just use earbuds if you like, and I do that quite often because it gets into the tiny little areas quite well, and it's cheap and most people have them around their house. And the reason that I like to blend out my pastels in between each layer is because you can only add a certain amount of layers before you start filling up the tooth of the paper, and then it will feel like the pastel is just slipping off or it's blending in with the layer below it. And to avoid this and to add a couple more layers than you think you can actually blend the pastel into the tooth of the paper. So you're basically pressing that layer of pastel into the paper so that you're still revealing some of that tooth. And this way it stops some of the pastel dust sort of sitting on top of the paper and filling up the tooth quicker than you'd want it to be filled up. And I find that this works really well because I can add more and more layers of pastel if I want to. Just keep in mind that when you blend out the pastel, it does actually blend away any details that you put down. So I'd recommend just trying to block in some of the colors to begin with, knowing that your detailed strokes will be blended out in these first few layers. So try to keep those really detailed areas to add on to the last final layers so you don't have to blend them out, because you'll end up redoing them every layer if you put in the details every layer and then blend it out. If you've got an area where you really need to brighten up the colors or you need to add some white highlights, I go back and use the conte sticks because they're a little bit softer than the pastel pencils, and this means that the color will show up a little bit brighter and easier on top of previous layers. If you find that you're still struggling to add more layers or add final details like whiskers, sometimes using a soft pastel on top will allow you to add that extra layer. I use Rembrandt soft pastel sticks or the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils for these details if I really need something softer than the conte sticks to go on top. And just remember that the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils are so soft, they really don't sharpen very well and they crumble really quite easily, so I only use them for the final details if I really need that extra saturation or highlight, because otherwise I'm going to end up wasting these pastel pencils and they're really quite expensive as well. But I do highly recommend getting like a really dark brown, a black and a white, because I use those really quite often to add in whiskers and things on animals that I've added too many layers to, because I can usually get that extra layer using the Caran d'Ache pastels. Usually with my layering process for pastels, I try and go 1 or 2 steps darker in the first few layers than I want the end result to be, because I usually go on top with a slightly lighter color to add in the details and contrast in the following layers after that. But if you have an area that is really bright, like almost white, or an area that's really dark, almost black, then I would recommend not going too much darker or too much lighter underneath those areas, because it will be very hard to go back to white or really, really dark once you've got another color underneath. Sometimes it will blend in with that previous layer and it will look a little bit muddy or grey rather than the really bright highlight that you want or the really dark shadow that you want. So if you do have an area that's really bright or really dark, I'd highly recommend trying to preserve that area and just use the lighter pencils or pastels in that area. And with the type of layering process that I do, so you want to try and think about it like you're working in fur layers when you're using your pastel pencils or soft pastels. You want to make sure that you're putting in the darkest shadows and the under fur, basically. You want to put that color in first so that when you add fur on top, you're adding in the lighter colors on top so that it looks like the fur is laying on top of each other. Hopefully that makes sense, but I'm basically saying try and get in the darkest colors of the fur first and then work your way up to the lightest colors on top of that. And now that the drawing has progressed quite a lot further, you can see that those really bright blues and the purples that I added in the first few layers are really quite subtle now, and it really makes it just look like a shadow rather than some abstract colours that I've just added in there for no reason. So don't be afraid to really add in those extra colours. It can really make your drawing pop. A lot of artists, especially when they're first starting out, are too scared to put in these really bright colours, and they end up just adding grey or black in the shadow areas and then white in the highlight areas on top of black fur. And the issue with that is that in both cases it makes the dog look older than it actually is. So I always use grey and black in my shadow areas, and I do use white in the highlight areas, but I never leave them just like that. I always add in other colours like the purples and blues in the shadow areas in both the black and white parts, or magenta or brown or whatever colour your fur is reflecting. I always add those colours on top of the white and the black, or mixed in with it, so that it doesn't look so grey and like it's got grey fur basically. This video on the screen shows you how you can draw all different types of fur using pastels, so click on that and I'll see you over there.